Exposure therapy is currently the most effective technique for treating OCD and anxiety disorders. According to research surveys, exposure and response prevention significantly reduces fear levels in 67% of people with PTSD, up to 77% in social anxiety, up to 90% in specific phobias, and in half of all clients with OCD. These numbers are remarkably high, but as you can see, different studies show varying results of effectiveness for exposure therapy. Why does this happen? Why don't all patients gain maximum benefit from it? A possible explanation is that exposure can be done incorrectly, and there is a whole range of potential mistakes, which we will explore in this video. Let's start with how exposure works in general. If you are chronically afraid and avoidant of some kinds of object, situations or thoughts, and this significantly disrupts your life, the solution to this problem is to purposefully engage with the object of your fear. This will provide your mind with critically important information needed to break free from that fear. Firstly, you will learn that your level of distress decreases even if you don't perform any rituals or avoidance. Secondly, you will realize that even without those protective actions, nothing terrible happens. Thirdly, you will come to understand that distress is tolerable. You won't lose your mind, and that despite the stress, you will be able to carry out necessary tasks, eat and sleep at least the minimum required by your body. What could go wrong with this seemingly straightforward method? At first glance, it looks simple. Face what scares you and endure it. To delve into the potential mistakes, I will analyze an article by a team of authors who have spent decades researching how exposure therapy works. It's called Common Pitfalls in Exposure and Response Prevention. So the first mistake is the avoidance of challenging exposures that provoke maximum fear and disgust. In a previous video, I outlined this extensively as a cause of possible relapses in anxiety and obsessions. Let's say you fear contracting an infection and feel disgusted by dirt. You wash your hands dozens of times a day, use rubber gloves and alcohol wipes, and ensure that dirtiness and cleanliness don't come into contact with each other. This went on for several years until you realized it was taking up too much of your energy and time. Determined to change, you spent a couple of months resisting fear and disgust and managed to stop using gloves, antiseptics and excessive hand washing. Now you only wash your hands after coming home, after using the bathroom and before eating. Gritting your teeth, you can now place your phone on the dining table and use it while eating. Overall, you've managed to return your cleanliness standards to what seems to be norm for most people. Would this be enough? No, especially if you still cannot allow yourself to walk around the apartment in outdoor shoes, lie on your bed in the same pants you wore on the subway, or avoid touching door handles in public places. OCD still has a loophole.
We didn't get infected, but maybe that's because we were cautious.
This loophole needs to be closed. Achieving this requires engaging in actions that an average person likely wouldn't undertake in their daily life. You need to aim higher on the hierarchy of exposure challenges, slightly crossing the line of what is considered the norm. Touch a trash can on the street, pressing your arms firmly against it. Eat food off the kitchen floor. Don't wash your hands after using public restroom. However, exposures should not be risky. You don't need to engage in unprotected sex or come into contact with someone's blood. At most, touching a trash can might cause diarrhea. In order to deal with OCD, you must be willing to pay this price. And this challenging practice will give you the invaluable sense that in your daily life, you can almost ignore cleanliness entirely and still lead a normal life. The next possible mistake is a variation of the previous one. There is a type of exposure that is carried out in the imagination. This method is used to address triggers that are not present in reality. Referring back to the earlier example of filth, you might imagine that touching a surface leads to infection, prolonged suffering, and eventual death. Deliberately immersing yourself in this imagery can be somewhat useful to reduce your sensitivity to it, although it won't be enough. Still, if your life is dominated by cleaning and avoiding filth, you must change your physical behavior, which has become an ingrained habit. These rigid rules of cleanliness can be only replaced by adopting new behaviors. Imagining touching a trash can is helpful, but it is not enough. You will have to actually touch it. The opposite situation is also possible. For example, you might have intrusive contrasting thoughts that you will lose control and stab a loved one with a knife. Such fears could compel you to stay away from knives, hide them out of sight, and avoid provoking yourself with their appearance. It seems logical that behavioral exposure would involve contact with a knife. For instance, sitting in the kitchen next to your spouse while holding a knife in your hand. A more effective strategy, however, may involve fully immersing yourself in the imagined scenario of what could unfold. This could involve writing and rereading a story about losing control, grabbing a knife, and committing violence. Since the soul of the fear is not the knife itself, but the horrific narrative that plays out in your imagination, you need to allow your mind to replay these fantasies freely to prove to yourself that they do not lead to anything terrible or push you toward action. The third mistake is distracting yourself during exposures. By engaging in exposure to a frightening situation, object, or thought, you are teaching yourself that it is possible to confront fear fully, intensify it deliberately, and still remain unharmed. But at the same time, internal safety mechanisms automatically activate, attempting to dampen the fear. This occurs because we are accustomed to avoid fear. Such avoidance can manifest in thinking about unrelated topics. For example, if you are working on panic attacks and engage in physical exercise to increase your heart rate and induce shortness of breath, these sensations can trigger memories of previous panic attacks and give rise to fear. At that moment, you might begin thinking about something pleasant to calm yourself down. For instance, mentally rehearsing tasks or conversations irrelevant to the exposure, daydreaming about pleasant experiences such as recent vacation or future plans. But calming down is not what we need during exposure. It is quite normal and even beneficial to focus on something pleasant after the session to reward yourself for the effort. But during exposure, you need to escalate your anxiety as much as possible to demonstrate to yourself that you are invulnerable to any level of unpleasant emotions and sensations. Interestingly, these distractions can also be purely emotional. When working with my patients on exposure during therapy sessions, I periodically ask them to report their level of fear at various moments during these practices. Sometimes at a point where a person should feel maximum stress, they report no anxiety and say that they feel nothing. What is happening at such a moment? It is emotional dissociation. The person has internally detached from their feelings and placed themselves in a protective mental state. In these circumstances, we take a few steps back and restart the exposure with slightly less difficulty so that the level of tension does not become overwhelming. We need to find the sweet spot. The exposure should be challenging enough but also manageable without avoidance. The next mistake is seeking reassurance or safety. From a rational perspective, we understand that the practices performed in exposure therapy are safe. There is absolutely no danger in lying on a bed in outdoor clothes. Although emotions might convey the opposite. Anxiety disorders arise from this desynchronization between knowledge and emotions. Emotions may signal intolerable risk and push you to seek guarantees that the practices you are about to perform won't harm you or others. In this request for reassurance, it is tempting to seek affirmations from a therapist, family members, the internet, or even yourself.
Is it really safe to eat food off the floor?
Will my pulse of 120 really not cause a stroke? Am I sure I won't lose control while imagining a violent scenario?
Receiving negative answers to these questions calms you down and makes your exposures ineffective. What should you do instead? Leave a degree of uncertainty in these questions. One of the goals of exposure therapy is to teach you to coexist with uncertainty. Take steps into the unknown with your eyes closed and develop the courage to take some perceived risks. Another form of unproductive self-soothing during exposure involves mental rituals. With physical rituals, things are quite clear. When you fear contamination, you'll have an urge to wash your hands. During exposure, it is essential to refrain from washing them. This goes without saying. But rituals can also take more subtle forms at the cognitive level. Sometimes these can be hard to distinguish from regular thoughts. They might seem like harmless ideas, such as telling yourself nothing bad will happen, or assuring yourself that your fear is irrational. You might silently repeat this to yourself multiple times. Or during exposure, you might imagine a positive future scenario, as if cancelling the bad outcome. You could also focus on the idea that you'll wash your hands soon, so having dirty hands right now isn't a big deal. Some people may also silently pray. Why do we call these compulsions? Because, like physical actions, they provide temporary relief but do nothing to reduce excessive focus on fears in the long term. In fact, they increase the importance of your fears, causing you to sink deeper into them. Again, they interfere with exposure therapy because during exposure we need to be afraid. Another potential shortcoming is working on the external aspect of compulsions without addressing the deeper meaning behind the anxiety. Here is an example. Some people obsessively wash their hands and are afraid to touch certain surfaces. Yet, they do this not because these surfaces or objects are dirty, but because they believe these objects carry bad vibes. This is called morphing, a dread that certain traits might be transferred to you through contact or surfaces. This could involve non-contagious diseases like cancer or drug addiction, or even personality traits like aggression or failure. This might sound weird to someone who hasn't had such beliefs, but it's also a manifestation of OCD. For these types of obsessions, the most effective exposure is not just to get your hands dirty, but intentionally immerse yourself in the idea that you will indeed acquire these unwanted traits and that they will change you irreversibly and forever. Choosing the right exposure targets is also crucial when working with panic attacks. What are we afraid of in a panic attack? To die or to lose consciousness? But sometimes the concern about fainting masks a deeper apprehension, not of the fainting itself, but of the anticipation of public humiliation.
I'll collapse or behave inappropriately. People will notice, single me out, and mock me. I won't be able to handle that.
For such an underlying worry, the emphasis should be placed on lowering sensitivity to others' opinions. This is done through exposures where you gradually provoke feelings of shame in public places. For example, in a shopping mall or on a subway, you could simulate deep breathing as if you are struggling for air, or roll your eyes as though you are about to faint. These actions might attract some attention from others and intensify your shame, but at the same time build your confidence that you can tolerate this shame and that nothing terrible will happen as a result. To summarize, when performing exposure therapy, it is important to follow several principles. Concentrate your efforts on the main essence of what you are afraid of. Take on challenging tasks. Do not avoid intense fear and shame and uncertainty, and refrain from giving yourself too much reassurance. Whether you're working through exposures on your own, with a psychologist, or supporting someone else, focus on these nuances. They are the key to maximizing the benefits of this practice.